Millionaire CEO who saved a little girl from a life of poverty in the countryside. What he discovers leaves him shocked. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Enjoy the journey. The Montana sky, stretched endlessly above the Wright family farm, once vibrant with life but now fading like an old photograph. The drought had claimed nearly everything. Crops withered in the fields, cattle grew thin, and hope evaporated with each passing day. Yet for 16-year-old Hannah Wright, the harsh landscape was merely a backdrop to a harsher reality. "Hannah, get your lazy behind out here and fix this fence." Frank's voice boomed across the yard, thick with the morning's first whiskey. Hannah set down her mother's worn copy of Pride and Prejudice and hurried outside, her slender frame moving with practiced efficiency. At 16, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her circumstances, threadbare clothes that hung from her narrow shoulders, and eyes that held knowledge beyond her years. "Coming, Frank," she called back, careful to keep any hint of resentment from her voice. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Hannah worked, her hands calloused from years of farm labor. Frank watched from the porch, nursing his drink while offering nothing but criticism. Her adoptive father hadn't always been this way. There were fragments of memories from her early childhood, before her mother Sarah died, when Frank would occasionally smile, even laugh. "You're doing it all wrong," Betty snapped, suddenly appearing beside Hannah. Her madrasta's face was pinched with perpetual disapproval. "Honestly, girl, after 8 years you'd think you'd have learned something useful." Hannah bit her tongue. 8 years since her mother had passed away from what they'd called a sudden illness. 8 years of being treated less like a daughter and more like an unwelcome servant. "Sorry, Betty," she murmured, adjusting her technique with the fence wire. Later that evening, as Hannah prepared a simple dinner from their dwindling supplies, the hushed voices of Frank and Betty drifted from the living room. "We can't keep going like this," Betty hissed. "The bank's gonna take everything if we don't get money soon." "You think I don't know that?" Frank's voice was slurred. "Maybe it's time to cash in. Tell the Collins everything." "Lower your voice, you fool." Betty's whisper was sharp as a blade. "You want her to hear?" Hannah froze, wooden spoon suspended above the pot. The Collins? She'd never heard that name before. "They've been paying us all these years to keep quiet," Frank continued, oblivious to Hannah's eavesdropping. "Maybe it's time they paid a bit more. And what if they just take her?" "Then what?" Betty countered. "So what if they do? One less mouth to feed." Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. Take her? What did Frank mean? Who were these Collins people? That night, lying on her thin mattress in the attic room, Hannah pulled out the small wooden box containing the few possessions her mother had left behind. A silver locket with a tiny photo of Sarah, a few well-worn books, and a delicate silver ring engraved with the initials S.W. Nothing that offered any clues about her past or these mysterious Collins people. The next morning brought no rain, only more heat and the weight of unanswered questions. As Hannah trudged to the barn to begin her chores, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in an old piece of mirror glass. Her mother's eyes stared back at her, intelligent, determined, and now filled with a new resolve. Someone knew the truth about her past. Someone called Collins, and somehow Hannah would find out what it was, even if it meant leaving behind the only life she'd ever known. 3 days later, the distant rumble of an expensive engine cut through the morning silence like thunder. Hannah looked up from where she was mending chicken wire, shielding her eyes against the sun as a gleaming black SUV approached down their dusty drive. The vehicle was completely out of place, pristine, luxurious, and worth more than their entire farm. It came to a smooth stop near the house, and Hannah watched a tall man in an immaculate charcoal suit step out. Even from a distance, she could see he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Frank! Frank, get out here!" Betty's voice cracked with panic from inside the house. Hannah crept closer, hiding behind the old grain silo where she could observe without being seen. The stranger surveyed their property with calculating eyes, his gaze lingering on the failing crops and weathered buildings. There was something almost sad in his expression mixed with what looked like recognition. Frank stumbled from the house, hastily buttoning a clean shirt over his belly. Hannah had never seen him move so quickly to make himself presentable. "Mr. Collins," Frank said, his usual gruff tone replaced by something Hannah had never heard before, respect tinged with fear. "You got my message then, Collins?" Hannah's breath caught in her throat. So this was one of the mysterious people Frank and Betty had been whispering about. "I did," the man replied, his voice smooth and educated. "Though I wish you'd chosen a different approach, Frank." "Desperate times," Frank muttered, wringing his hands. "The drought, the bills. We can't keep going without more help." Betty appeared in the doorway, wearing her best dress, the navy blue one she saved for church and town visits. "Mr. Collins, please come in. We have coffee ready." The stranger, Mr. Collins, nodded politely but continued scanning the property. "Where is she?" Hannah's heart nearly stopped. He was looking for her. "Working, always working, that girl," Betty said quickly. Hannah, come here." There was no choice but to obey. Hannah forced her legs to carry her forward, acutely aware of her dirty clothes and tangled hair. As she approached, Mr. Collins turned his full attention to her, and she was struck by his eyes, dark, intense, and filled with an emotion she couldn't identify. "Hannah," he said softly, as if testing the name on his tongue. "You look just like—" He caught himself, clearing his throat. "Like what?" Hannah found herself asking, her voice barely a whisper. "Like someone I used to know," he said carefully. "My name is Matthew Collins." The way he studied her face made Hannah's skin crawl with unease. It wasn't predatory, but it was deeply unsettling, as if he was seeing a ghost. "Go clean yourself up, girl," Frank commanded roughly. "Make yourself presentable for Mr. Collins." "Actually," Matthew interjected, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, "we need to talk first. All of us." Hannah watched Frank and Betty exchange nervous glances. Whatever hold this man had over them, it was powerful enough to make Frank, who'd never deferred to anyone, step aside immediately. Of course, Betty stammered. "Please, come inside." As they moved toward the house, Hannah caught Matthew Collins glancing back at her one more time. In that brief moment, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Guilt. Deep, crushing guilt. What did this wealthy stranger want with her? And why did Frank and Betty seem so afraid of him? Standing alone in the dusty yard, Hannah realized her life was about to change forever. The only question was whether that change would save her or destroy her. Inside the cramped living room, Hannah perched on the edge of the worn sofa, her heart pounding as Matthew Collins settled into Frank's usual chair with the ease of someone claiming territory. A second car had arrived, a plain sedan carrying a woman in a navy blazer who introduced herself as Ms. Rodriguez from Child Services. "Let me be direct," Matthew began, his fingers steepled. "I'm here to offer Hannah opportunities she could never have in this situation." Hannah's stomach lurched. They were talking about her as if she weren't sitting right there. "What kind of opportunities?" Frank asked, but his eyes were already calculating. "Education. A proper home. A future." Matthew's gaze found Hannah's. "I have connections to the finest schools in Seattle, Harvard preparation programs, resources that could transform her life." "And what's in it for you?" Betty interjected, suspicion creeping into her voice. Matthew's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let's just say I have personal reasons for wanting to help." Ms. Rodriguez cleared her throat, pulling out a folder thick with papers. "Mr. Collins has undergone extensive background checks. His home has been evaluated and approved for guardianship. Placement." Hannah's world tilted. "Guardianship? What are you talking about?" "Now, Hannah," Frank said in a tone she'd never heard before, almost gentle. "Mr. Collins is offering you a chance at a real life. Good schools, nice clothes, everything we can't give you here." "I don't want to leave," Hannah whispered, though even as she said it, she wondered if it was true. The decision isn't entirely yours, Ms. Rodriguez said kindly. Given the current living conditions and financial instability here, she gestured around the shabby room with peeling wallpaper and furniture held together with tape and hope. Matthew reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope. Hannah watched in horror as he placed it on the coffee table between them. Frank's eyes locked onto it like a predator spotting prey. This should cover any transition costs, Matthew said carefully, along with the monthly payments we discussed. Monthly payments. The words hit Hannah like a physical blow. She was being sold. Actually sold, like livestock at auction. "You're buying me?" she said, her voice cracking. "You're actually buying me from them?" "Hannah, it's not like that," Ms. Rodriguez began. "Isn't it?" Hannah stood abruptly, tears streaming down her face. "He just handed them money for me. What else would you call it?" "An investment in your future," Matthew said quietly. "Sometimes the right choice doesn't feel good in the moment." Frank snatched the envelope from the table with unseemly haste. "Hannah, you're being dramatic. Mr. Collins is trying to help you." "Help himself, more like," Hannah shot back. "Why me? Why now? You don't even know me." For a moment, Matthew's composed facade cracked, and Hannah glimpsed something raw underneath. Pain, regret, and that same crushing guilt she'd noticed outside. "I know more than you think," he said softly. The cryptic response only fueled Hannah's rage. "I won't go. You can't make me." "Actually," Ms. Rodriguez said, consulting her papers, "given your age and circumstances, the state has authority to place you in what we determine to be your best interests." Hannah felt the walls closing in. Even the government was against her. She looked desperately at Frank and Betty, seeking any sign that they might fight for her. But Frank was already counting the money in the envelope while Betty stared at the floor. "When?" Hannah asked, her voice barely audible. "Tomorrow morning," Matthew replied. "Pack light. Everything you need will be provided." As Hannah fled to her attic room, she could hear the adults below finalizing her fate with the casual efficiency of a business transaction. That night, she lay awake clutching her mother's silver locket, wondering what Sarah would think of her daughter being traded away for cash. Tomorrow, she would leave the only home she'd ever known for a stranger's house in a distant city, and, deep down, despite her fear and anger, a tiny voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, anything had to be better than this. The Collins estate loomed before Hannah like something from a fairy tale. All gleaming windows, manicured gardens, and intimidating grandeur. As Matthew's SUV wound up the circular driveway, Hannah pressed her face to the window, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of wealth on display. "Welcome to your new home," Matthew said, though his tone suggested uncertainty about whether that was truly accurate. A stern-faced woman in her 60s appeared at the massive front doors. Her gray hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her black uniform was immaculate. "This is Mrs. Parker, our housekeeper," Matthew explained as they climbed the marble steps. "She'll help you get settled." Mrs. Parker's eyes swept over Hannah's thrift store clothes and single-worn duffel bag with barely concealed disdain. "Good afternoon, miss," she said coldly. "Your room is ready." Before Hannah could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. An elegant woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes that probably cost more than Frank's truck. "So this is her," the woman said, her voice carrying the kind of cultured accent that spoke of private schools and country clubs. Her blue eyes were ice cold as they assessed Hannah. "Hannah, meet my wife, Victoria," Matthew said, tension creeping into his voice. Victoria's smile was as fake as her pearl necklace was real. "How quaint." "Matthew, darling, are you sure about this arrangement? What will people say when they see?" She gestured vaguely at Hannah's appearance. "Victoria," Matthew warned quietly. "I'm just thinking of our reputation," Victoria continued, her voice honey-sweet but venomous. "The Pemberton Charity Gala is next week. The senator will be there along with the entire social committee." Hannah felt her cheeks burn. She might be young, but she understood perfectly well that Victoria was calling her an embarrassment. "Perhaps we should discuss this later," Matthew said firmly. Mrs. Parker cleared her throat. "Shall I show Miss Wright to her quarters?" As they walked through halls lined with expensive artwork and antique furniture, Hannah felt like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. Everything was beautiful and cold, polished to perfection, but somehow lifeless. "These are your rooms," Mrs. Parker announced, opening a door to reveal a bedroom larger than the entire downstairs of the farmhouse. Hannah gasped despite herself. A four-poster bed dominated the space, draped in silk curtains. A mahogany desk sat by tall windows overlooking the gardens, and there was even a small sitting area with a fireplace. "The bathroom is through there," Mrs. Parker continued briskly. "Dinner is served at 7 sharp. Mr. Collins has arranged for a tutor and other professionals to evaluate your needs." Other professionals. The phrase sent a chill down Hannah's spine. Alone at last, Hannah set her duffel bag on the pristine carpet and looked around the room that was supposed to be hers. Despite the luxury, it felt more like a beautiful prison than a sanctuary. She moved to the window and gazed out at the perfectly manicured gardens where not a single leaf dared to be out of place. A groundskeeper was trimming hedges with mechanical precision, and Hannah wondered if he was as trapped in this perfect world as she suddenly felt. That evening, dinner was a stilted affair in a dining room that could have seated 20. Victoria made pointed comments about proper etiquette while picking at her salmon, and Matthew mostly stayed silent, occasionally shooting his wife warning looks. "I've arranged for Dr. Montgomery to see you tomorrow," Matthew told Hannah as dessert was served. "Just a routine evaluation. Nothing to worry about." But Hannah was beginning to realize that in this house, everything was something to worry about. The luxury came with strings attached, and she was only beginning to understand how tightly bound she really was. As she lay in the enormous bed that night, Hannah clutched her mother's locket and whispered a promise to the darkness. She would find out why Matthew Collins had really brought her here, no matter what it cost. 2 weeks of psychological evaluations, tutoring sessions, and awkward family dinners had passed when Matthew finally knocked on Hannah's bedroom door one evening. His usual confident demeanor seemed strained, and he clutched a manila folder in his hands. "We need to talk," he said, settling into the chair across from her bed. "About why you're really here?" Hannah set down her book, one of dozens that had mysteriously appeared on her shelves, and waited. She'd learned that silence often revealed more than questions. "You're not Frank's biological daughter," Matthew began, his words careful and measured. "Your real father was my younger brother, James." The revelation hit Hannah like cold water. "Your brother?" Matthew nodded, opening the folder to reveal several photographs. The first showed a man who looked strikingly like Hannah, the same dark hair, intelligent eyes, and stubborn chin. "James died 5 years ago. Cancer." Matthew's voice grew softer. "Before he passed, he told me about you. About your mother, Sarah." Hannah's hands trembled as she studied her father's face. "He knew about me?" "He did. They met when Sarah was working, temporarily for our family. When she became pregnant, circumstances were complicated." Matthew's discomfort was palpable. "After Sarah died, Frank, who was her cousin, agreed to raise you in exchange for financial support." "So you've been paying him all along," Hannah said, pieces clicking into place. "That's why he never wanted me to ask questions about my past. Frank was supposed to provide for your education, give you a good life," Matthew continued. "When I learned he wasn't honoring that agreement, I decided to bring you here myself." Hannah studied the photographs again, searching for answers in her father's frozen smile. "Why now? Why didn't you come sooner?" Matthew's jaw tightened. "There were legal complications, family obligations. I respected the arrangement with Frank, until he threatened to expose something," Hannah finished, remembering the phone calls she'd overheard. "Frank was facing financial ruin. He became demanding, unreasonable." Hannah looked up from the photos, meeting Matthew's gaze directly. "What aren't you telling me?" For a moment, Matthew's composure cracked. "What do you mean?" "There's more. to this story. I can see it in your face." Hannah's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "You look guilty, not grieving, and Victoria treats me like I'm some kind of scandal waiting to happen." Matthew stood abruptly, gathering the photographs. "You're imagining things. You've been through trauma. Dr. Montgomery explained that suspicion is normal after what you've endured." "Don't patronize me," Hannah snapped. "I may be 16, but I'm not stupid." "No," Matthew agreed quietly. "You're not stupid at all. You're exactly like James in that way." After he left, Hannah sat in the darkness of her luxurious room, studying the one photograph he'd left behind. Her father looked young in the picture, probably not much older than she was now. But there was something in his expression, a sadness, that seemed deeper than just illness. She thought about Matthew's nervous energy, Victoria's obvious resentment, and the way Mrs. Parker sometimes looked at her with what might have been pity. Everyone in this house was keeping secrets, and Hannah was beginning to suspect that the truth about her parents' relationship was far more complicated than Matthew wanted her to believe. That night, she made another promise to herself. She would uncover every secret this family was hiding, starting with whatever had really happened between her teenage mother and her uncle's younger brother. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of careful explanations and comfortable lies. And Hannah Wright had never backed down from a challenge in her life. 3 months had passed since Hannah's arrival at the Collins estate, and she had settled into a routine that felt both privileged and suffocating. Whitmore Academy, Seattle's most prestigious private school, had welcomed her with the kind of deference that money could buy, though her classmates treated her with curious distance. "Miss Wright, your essay on Shakespearean tragedy is remarkable," Mrs. Henley announced during English literature class, "particularly considering your background." Hannah forced a smile, hating the way teachers constantly referenced her disadvantaged origins, as if her intelligence was somehow miraculous rather than earned. She'd grown tired of being their charity case success story. At lunch, she sat alone, in the Academy's marble-column dining hall, surrounded by the privileged children of Seattle's elite. They whispered about her when they thought she couldn't hear, the farm girl living with the Collins family, the mysterious ward with the tragic past. "You know they're all dying to know your story," a voice said behind her. Hannah turned to see Eliza Martinez, the gardener's daughter who attended the local community college. At 19, Eliza had a warmth that was entirely absent from Hannah's wealthy classmates. "Let them wonder," Hannah replied, making room at her table. "My dad says Mr. Collins has been different since you arrived," Eliza continued, unwrapping a homemade sandwich. "More nervous. Victoria's been giving the staff impossible tasks. I think she's taking her frustration out on us." Hannah had noticed Victoria's increasingly hostile behavior. Last week she'd overheard her on the phone complaining to someone about Matthew's little project ruining our social standing. "What was he like before?" "Your dad would know," Hannah asked, focused, driven, but never anxious like this. Eliza lowered her voice. "Dad's worked for the Collins family for 15 years. He says there's always been secrets, but this feels different." That evening, Hannah excelled in her piano lesson, her fingers moving across the keys with natural grace. That surprised even her instructor. When she played Chopin's nocturnes, she could almost forget the web of lies surrounding her life. "Remarkable progress," Professor Chen said, closing his music folder. "You have an intuitive understanding of the emotional depths. Have you had music training before?" "Not really. My mother had a small piano she'd play sometimes." Hannah's voice grew soft. "I remember the melodies." At dinner, Matthew seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone. Victoria picked at her food while discussing the upcoming charity auction. "The Pemberton Foundation's annual gala is next month," Victoria announced. "I've told everyone you'll be attending, Matthew. We simply can't miss it again." "Of course," Matthew replied absently. "And what about her?" Victoria's fork clinked against her plate as she gestured toward Hannah. "Hannah is part of this family now," Matthew said firmly. Victoria's laugh was sharp as crystal. "Part of the family? Matthew, darling. She's a ward. There's a rather significant difference. Hannah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she'd learned to keep her emotions in check. Instead, she focused on her perfectly prepared meal and thought about the inconsistencies in Matthew's story about her parents. Later that night, while walking through the estate's gardens, Hannah found herself drawn to the groundskeeper's cottage where Eliza lived with her father. Through the window, she could see them sharing a simple dinner, laughing over some private joke. It struck her that despite their modest circumstances, they possessed something the Collins mansion lacked entirely: genuine affection. Standing in the manicured garden where every flower was precisely placed, Hannah realized she was living in the most beautiful cage she'd ever seen. The question was whether the bars were meant to keep her in, or to keep something else out. As she walked back to the house, she noticed Matthew's study light burning late into the night, and wondered what secrets he was guarding so carefully behind those locked doors. The emergency call came at midnight, a server crash at Collins Tech that demanded Matthew's immediate attention. Hannah watched from her bedroom window as his car sped down the driveway, red taillights disappearing into the darkness. For the first time since her arrival, Matthew had left his private study unlocked. Hannah waited 30 minutes to ensure he wouldn't return, then crept through the mansion's silent corridors. The study door opened with barely a whisper, revealing Matthew's sanctuary: leather-bound books, expensive artwork, and a massive mahogany desk that commanded the room. Her hands trembled as she approached the filing cabinets. The third drawer bore a simple label: personal, confidential. Inside, a thick manila folder caught her attention, her own name written across the tab in Matthew's precise handwriting. The first document nearly stopped her heart: a birth certificate showing her mother's age at Hannah's birth, 16 years old. James Collins had been 28. "Oh my God," Hannah whispered, sinking into Matthew's chair. She photographed page after page with shaking hands. Newspaper clippings with headlines like "Tech Heirs Scandal Covered Up" and "Minor Employee's Pregnancy Raises Questions." There were payment records stretching back 16 years, showing monthly transfers to Frank Wright. Legal documents discussing damage control and public relations management. But the most devastating discovery was a copy of James's will, dated just months before his death. It clearly stated that Hannah Wright Collins was to inherit half of his estate, including substantial shares in Collins Tech, upon reaching 18 years of age. Collins. Her legal name was Hannah Wright Collins. A letter paper-clipped to the will made her blood run cold. "Matthew, I know what I did was unforgivable. Sarah was just a kid and I was supposed to protect her, not take advantage. The cancer has given me time to think about the damage I caused. Hannah deserves better than the secrets and shame our family creates. When she turns 18, tell her everything. Give her the choice I stole from her mother. James." Hannah's vision blurred with tears of rage and grief. Her father hadn't just had an inappropriate relationship with her teenage mother. He'd known it was wrong, known he was destroying a child's life. The sound of a car in the driveway sent panic shooting through her veins. Hannah quickly photographed the remaining documents, including email exchanges between Matthew and Frank, where Frank threatened to tell everyone about James and that girl, unless payments increased. She was replacing the folder when footsteps echoed in the hallway. Hannah barely managed to slip out through the study's side door, her heart hammering as she heard Matthew's voice talking to someone on his phone. "No, everything's secure. The information stays buried until she's 18, just like James wanted. Frank won't be a problem much longer." Hannah pressed herself against the wall, processing Matthew's words. What did he mean, Frank won't be a problem? Back in her room, she stared at the photos on her phone, each image revealing another layer of betrayal. Her father had been a predator, her mother had been his victim, and Matthew had been covering it up for 16 years, using her inheritance to buy Frank's silence. But the most chilling realization was that Matthew clearly intended to continue hiding the truth until her 18th birthday, if he planned to tell her at all. Hannah had thought she was living in a beautiful prison, but now she understood the truth. She wasn't just a ward or a charity. case. She was the living evidence of a crime, hidden away where she couldn't ask inconvenient questions or threaten the Collins family's reputation. The question was no longer whether she could uncover their secrets. The question was whether she could stay alive long enough to expose them. As dawn broke over the pristine gardens, Hannah began planning her next move. Frank might be a drunk and a blackmailer, but he was also the only person who knew the complete truth about her parents. She had to find a way to contact him before Matthew made sure he wouldn't be a problem anymore. The emergency call came at midnight, a server crash at Collins Tech that demanded Matthew's immediate attention. Hannah watched from her bedroom window as his car sped down the driveway, red taillights disappearing into the darkness. For the first time since her arrival, Matthew had left his private study unlocked. Hannah waited 30 minutes to ensure he wouldn't return, then crept through the mansion's silent corridors. The study door opened with barely a whisper, revealing Matthew's sanctuary, leather-bound books, expensive artwork, and a massive mahogany desk that commanded the room. Her hands trembled as she approached the filing cabinets. The third drawer bore a simple label, personal, confidential. Inside, a thick manila folder caught her attention, her own name written across the tab in Matthew's precise handwriting. The first document nearly stopped her heart. A birth certificate showing her mother's age at Hannah's birth, 16 years. Old. James Collins had been 28. "Oh my God," Hannah whispered, sinking into Matthew's chair. She photographed page after page with shaking hands. Newspaper, clippings with headlines like "Tech Heirs Scandal Covered Up" and "Minor Employee's Pregnancy Raises Questions." There were payment records stretching back 16 years, showing monthly transfers to Frank Wright. Legal documents discussing damage control and public relations management. But the most devastating discovery was a copy of James's will, dated just months before his death. It clearly stated that Hannah Wright Collins was to inherit half of his estate, including substantial shares in Collins Tech, upon reaching 18 years of age. Collins. Her legal name was Hannah Wright Collins. A letter paperclipped to the will made her blood run cold. "Matthew, I know what I did was unforgivable. Sarah was just a kid, and I was supposed to protect her, not take advantage. The cancer has given me time to think about the damage I caused. Hannah deserves better than the secrets and shame our family creates. When she turns 18, tell her everything. Give her the choice I stole from her mother. James." Hannah's vision blurred with tears of rage and grief. Her father hadn't just had an inappropriate relationship with her teenage mother. He'd known it was wrong, known he was destroying a child's life. The sound of a car in the driveway sent panic shooting through her veins. Hannah quickly photographed the remaining documents, including email exchanges between Matthew and Frank, where Frank threatened to tell everyone about James and that girl unless payments increased. She was replacing the folder when footsteps echoed in the hallway. Hannah barely managed to slip out through the study's side door, her heart hammering as she heard Matthew's voice talking to someone on his phone. "No, everything's secure. The information stays buried until she's 18, just like James wanted. Frank won't be a problem much longer." Hannah pressed herself against the wall, processing Matthew's words. What did he mean, Frank won't be a problem? Back in her room, she stared at the photos on her phone, each image revealing another layer of betrayal. Her father had been a predator, her mother had been his victim, and Matthew had been covering it up for 16 years, using her inheritance to buy Frank's silence. But the most chilling realization was that Matthew clearly intended to continue hiding the truth until her 18th birthday, if he planned to tell her at all. Hannah had thought she was living in a beautiful prison, but now she understood the truth. She wasn't just a ward or a charity case. She was the living evidence of a crime, hidden away where she couldn't ask inconvenient questions or threaten the Collins family's reputation. The question was no longer whether she could uncover their secrets. The question was whether she could stay alive long enough to expose them. As dawn broke over the pristine gardens, Hannah began planning her next move. Frank might be a drunk and a blackmailer, but he was also the only person who knew the complete truth about her parents. She had to find a way to contact him before Matthew made sure he wouldn't be a problem anymore. 3 weeks after Hannah's devastating discovery, the Collins mansion was hosting its annual charity benefit, a glittering affair meant to showcase the family's philanthropy to Seattle's elite. Hannah had been instructed to make a brief appearance, but otherwise stay out of sight. She was adjusting her borrowed evening dress when commotion erupted downstairs. Shouting voices, the sharp click of expensive heels on marble, and beneath it all, a slurred voice she recognized with growing horror. Frank. Hannah crept to the top of the grand staircase, her heart sinking as she saw him weaving through the crowd of shocked guests. His clothes were wrinkled, his face flushed with alcohol and rage, and his voice carried across the elegant foyer like a foghorn. "Where's your precious host?" Frank bellowed, grabbing a champagne flute from a passing waiter. "Matthew Collins, come out here and face me like a man." Victoria appeared instantly, her face pale with mortification. "Security, get this man out of here immediately." But Frank was beyond caring about consequences. "You all think you know the Collins family? Let me tell you about the real Matthew Collins." Hannah watched Matthew emerge from a cluster of donors, his face a mask of controlled fury. 2 security guards flanked him, but Frank seemed oblivious to the threat. "Frank, you're drunk," Matthew said quietly, his voice carrying deadly warning. "Leave now and we can discuss this privately." "Privately?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Like you discussed it privately when your precious brother knocked up a 16-year-old girl? When he destroyed my cousin Sarah's life?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Hannah saw several guests reaching for their phones, and Victoria looked ready to faint. "You don't know what you're talking about," Matthew hissed, stepping closer. "Don't I?" Frank swayed dangerously, but his eyes remained focused. "I know James Collins got Sarah pregnant when she was just a kid working at your summer house. I know you've been paying me to keep quiet for 16 years. And I know you brought that girl here to keep her from learning the truth." Hannah's blood ran cold as she realized Frank was talking about her. Several guests had now turned to stare up at her on the staircase. "You promised me more money," Frank continued, his voice rising. "Said the payments would increase when she turned 16. Well, where is it, Matthew? Where's my compensation for keeping your family's dirty secret?" Matthew nodded almost imperceptibly to the security guards who began moving toward Frank. But Frank wasn't finished. "That envelope you gave me was light, Collins. Real light. You think you can cheat me now that you've got the girl? Think again. I've got documents, recordings, everything that proves what your brother did." "Frank, stop," Matthew said, his voice deadly quiet. "Everyone should know the truth. Sarah was just a baby when James—" The security guards grabbed Frank's arms, cutting off his words. But the damage was done. The entire room buzzed with shocked whispers, and Hannah could see phones being raised to capture video. "Get him to my office," Matthew ordered curtly. "Now." As they dragged Frank away, Hannah caught Victoria's eye. Her stepmother's expression was pure venom, and Hannah knew that whatever sympathy she might have had for her situation had just evaporated. The guests began filing out with unseemly haste, their conversations already shifting to speculation and gossip. Hannah remained frozen on the staircase, watching her world collapse in real time. Frank had just destroyed any chance of keeping the family's secret buried. But more importantly, he'd revealed the depths of the lies Hannah had been living. As the mansion emptied, Hannah realized that Frank, drunk, desperate, and probably doomed, might be her only chance of learning the complete truth before Matthew silenced him forever. She had to get to Frank before Matthew did something they'd all regret. The only question was whether she was already too late. Hannah pressed her ear against Matthew's study door, her heart pounding as angry voices escalated inside. Through the heavy oak she could hear Frank's slurred accusations and Victoria's sharp protests. "You ruined everything." Victoria's voice cracked with fury. 16 years of careful reputation management destroyed in one night. The deal was more money when she turned 16, Frank shot back. "You cheapskates thought you could shortchange me now that you have her under your roof." "You're done, Frank." Matthew's voice was ice cold. "No more payments, no more contact. You've just signed your own—" The sound of a physical struggle sent Hannah's hand to the door handle. She heard furniture scraping, a grunt of effort, then Frank's voice turned desperate. You can't silence me. I've got copies of everything hidden where the sickening crack of skull against marble cut him off mid-sentence. Hannah burst through the door to find Frank crumpled beside Matthew's desk, blood pooling beneath his head. The ornate marble corner was stained crimson. Frank! Hannah dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her fingers against his neck. No pulse. His eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. Get away from him, Matthew commanded, but his voice shook. He's dead, Hannah whispered, looking up at Matthew and Victoria in horror. You killed him. It was an accident, Victoria said quickly. He stumbled, fell. You saw it yourself. I saw you fighting with him. Hannah scrambled to her feet. We have to call 911, get an ambulance. No. Matthew's voice cut through her panic. Think about what you're saying, Hannah. The scandal this would create, the investigation, the questions about why Frank was here. He's dead. Hannah's voice cracked. You can't what? Victoria stepped closer, her designer gown untouched despite the violence. Can't protect this family from complete destruction? Your drunk foster father just humiliated us in front of Seattle's most influential people. Do you want to add a police investigation to that disaster? Hannah stared at them both, recognizing something monstrous beneath their cultured facades. You're going to cover this up. We're going to handle this discreetly, Matthew corrected. Frank was drunk, unstable. If we call the police now, it becomes a media circus. Your name, your mother's story, everything gets dragged through the tabloids. So what's your alternative? Hannah demanded. Matthew pulled out his phone. I'm calling our security team, men I trust completely. Frank was never here tonight. He left after making those ridiculous accusations. If anyone asks, he was distraught, probably went off to drink himself to death somewhere. You can't be serious. I'm perfectly serious. Matthew's eyes were hard as steel. And you're going to help us, Hannah. Because if this story comes out, if there's an investigation, do you think anyone will believe the traumatized teenager who's been living under psychiatric care? The threat hung in the air like poison. Hannah realized that Matthew was reminding her of Dr. Montgomery's reports, the evaluations that portrayed her as fragile and potentially unstable. Who would believe, Victoria added sweetly, that poor, little Hannah Wright wasn't involved in her foster father's death? After all, he was blackmailing the family that rescued her from poverty. Hannah felt the walls closing in. They were right. She had no allies, no proof, no credibility against their wealth and influence. I won't lie for you, she whispered. You won't have to lie, Matthew said, already dialing a number. You'll simply say nothing at all. As Matthew spoke in low tones to whoever answered his call, Hannah looked down at Frank's lifeless face. He'd been a drunk and a blackmailer, but he'd also been the only person who knew the complete truth about her parents. Now that truth was buried with him, and Hannah was trapped in a mansion with two people who'd just proven they would kill too. Protect their secrets. The question was, would she be next? Sleep became Hannah's enemy. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Frank's lifeless stare and heard the sickening crack of his skull against marble. 3 weeks had passed since that horrific night, and the official story was simple. Frank Wright had left the charity gala drunk and distraught, disappearing into the Seattle night. No one had seen him since. You look terrible, Eliza observed during their lunch at the academy. Are you eating at all? Hannah pushed food around her plate, her appetite non-existent. Just tired. My dad says there were police at the estate last week. Something about that man who caused the scene at the gala? Hannah's fork clattered against her plate. What did they want? Routine questions. Apparently he was reported missing by some bar owner in Montana. Eliza leaned closer. Hannah, what really happened that night? I don't know, Hannah lied, hating herself for it. That afternoon, Hannah made an excuse to visit the Academy's library, where she spent hours researching legal procedures and missing persons cases. She learned that without a body or evidence of foul play, Frank's disappearance would likely remain an open file gathering dust. But Hannah needed allies, and she needed proof. During computer class, she carefully searched for information about her mother's employment history with the Collins family. A breakthrough came when she found archived construction permits for the Collins summer house renovation 15 years ago, the project where Sarah would have worked. The contractor was Morrison and Associates, she whispered to herself, screenshotting the information. That evening, she overheard Victoria on the phone in the garden, her voice carrying through the open window. Of course the police came by, Mother. But Matthew handled it beautifully. 2 officers very understanding about family privacy. The donation to the Police Benevolent Fund last month was well-timed. Hannah's blood ran cold. They'd bought police cooperation. No, there's no evidence of anything, Victoria continued. The man was a known alcoholic with a history of erratic behavior. These types often just disappear. Late that night, Hannah received an unexpected email from an address she didn't recognize. Hannah, I have information about your mother you need to see. Frank wasn't the only one who knew the truth. If you want answers, meet me at Pike Place. Mark it tomorrow at 3 p.m. Stall 47, come alone. A friend. Hannah stared at the message, her heart racing. It could be a trap, but it could also be her only chance to find someone who knew the real story. The next day, she told Mrs. Parker she was staying late for drama club rehearsal, then took the bus downtown. Pike Place Market bustled with afternoon crowds, the smell of fresh fish and coffee filling the air. Stall 47 sold vintage jewelry and antiques. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying brown hair. You must be Hannah, the woman said softly. You look exactly like your mother when she was your age. Who are you? Hannah asked. My name is Nancy Thompson. I was a nurse at Seattle General when your father was receiving cancer treatment. She glanced around nervously. What I'm about to tell you could get us both in serious trouble. Nancy reached under the counter and pulled out a manila envelope. Your father gave me this before he died with instructions to contact you when you turned 16. He said if anything happened to prevent his family from telling you the truth, I should make sure you knew. Hannah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were medical records, legal documents, and a handwritten letter in faded ink. James Collins was eaten alive by guilt, Nancy continued quietly. He knew what he'd done to your mother was unforgivable. The cancer gave him time to think, to plan how to make amends. Hannah began reading her father's letter, tears blurring her vision. Hannah, if you're reading this, then something has prevented my family from honoring my wishes. You deserve to know that I left you half of everything I owned, including shares in Collins Tech. But more importantly, you deserve to know that your mother was a brave, intelligent girl who deserved so much better than what I gave her. Nancy squeezed Hannah's shoulder gently. There's more, child. Frank wasn't the only one who knew the truth about James and Sarah, and I'm not the only one who can help you. For the first time since Frank's death, Hannah felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight after all. Nancy Thompson's small apartment overlooked Puget Sound, its walls lined with medical textbooks and family photographs. Hannah sat on the worn sofa, clutching the envelope containing her father's letter while Nancy prepared tea with shaking hands. I've been carrying this burden for 5 years, Nancy said, settling into the chair across from Hannah. Your father made me promise to watch over you from a distance, to ensure you received what was rightfully yours. Matthew told me James died knowing about me, but that there were legal complications, Hannah said carefully. Nancy's laugh was bitter. Legal complications. Is that what they're calling theft now? She pulled out a thick folder from beneath her coffee table. James Collins spent his final months making arrangements for you. He had DNA tests done to establish paternity beyond doubt. He consulted lawyers about creating a trust that Matthew couldn't touch. Most importantly, he documented everything about your mother's employment and their relationship. Hannah opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were bank statements showing massive transfers from James's personal accounts to a trust fund in her name, legal documents establishing her as his heir, and a notarized will leaving her 50% of his assets, including voting shares, in Collins Tech. Matthew was executor of the will, Nancy continued. He was supposed to maintain the trust until you turned 18, then reveal everything. Instead, he's been using your inheritance to expand his own business empire. How do you know all this? Because James didn't trust his brother completely. He gave me copies of everything and asked me to serve as an independent witness. Nancy's voice grew heavy. He also predicted that Matthew might try to control the narrative about your parents' relationship. Hannah found a medical report documenting James's confession to his oncologist. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what had happened. A powerful man taking advantage of a teenage employee, the pregnancy that resulted, and the family's subsequent efforts to hide the scandal. Your mother was 16, working summers to help support her family, Nancy explained. James was 28 and should have known better. When Sarah told him she was pregnant, the Collins family went into damage control mode. They paid her off. Worse. They convinced her she was partly to blame, that speaking out would ruin her life and yours. Sarah was just a frightened kid who believed them when they said keeping quiet was best for everyone. Hannah studied a photograph of her mother. Young, beautiful, and heartbreakingly naive. She died when I was 8. What really happened to her? Nancy's expression grew pained. Sarah struggled with depression for years. The guilt, the shame, the isolation, it consumed her. When she died, it wasn't entirely natural. The implication hit Hannah like a physical blow. Her mother had taken her own life, driven to despair by the Collins family's manipulation and abandonment. James didn't learn about Sarah's death until years later, Nancy continued. When he did, the guilt nearly destroyed him. That's when he started making plans to contact you, to try to make amends. But he died before he could. Yes. And Matthew inherited control of both the company and the responsibility for you. James assumed his brother would honor his wishes. Nancy shook her head sadly. He underestimated how deeply corruption can run in a family. Hannah looked through more documents, email exchanges between James and his lawyers, detailed financial records, and most damning of all, a recording device Nancy pulled from a drawer. James asked me to record his final conversation with Matthew about you, Nancy said, holding up the small digital recorder. He wanted evidence of his instructions just in case. Hannah listened in growing horror as her father's weak voice gave explicit instructions about her inheritance, her education, and the revelation of the truth about her parentage. Matthew's responses were appropriately solemn, promising to honor every detail of his brother's wishes. He lied, Hannah whispered. He did more than lie. He's stolen millions that belong to you, hidden your true identity, and now... Nancy's voice trailed off. Now he's covered up a murder, Hannah finished. Nancy's eyes widened. What do you mean? Hannah told her about Frank's death, watching Nancy's face grow pale with each detail. My God, Nancy breathed. This has gone far beyond financial fraud. Hannah, you're in real danger. I know. That's why I need your help. Nancy stood and moved to her window, looking out at the darkening sky. There's something else, child. Something I haven't told you yet. What? James wasn't the only Collins family member who knew the truth about your parents. There was another witness to their relationship. Someone who's been watching from the shadows all these years. Hannah's heart began to race. Who? Nancy turned back to face her, determination replacing fear in her expression. Someone with the power to bring Matthew down once and for all. Nancy walked to an old filing cabinet and withdrew a business card yellowed with age. Eleanor Collins Patterson, Matthew and James's aunt. She was the family matriarch when your parents met. Hannah studied the card. She's still alive? Very much so, and very angry about what Matthew has done to James's memory. Nancy sat back down, her voice dropping to a whisper. Eleanor was the one who originally hired your mother for the summer house project. She witnessed firsthand how James pursued Sarah, how the family covered it up, and how they treated your mother afterward. Why hasn't she spoken up before now? Family loyalty, old-fashioned shame, but mostly because she believed Matthew would eventually do the right thing. Nancy's expression hardened. When James was dying, Eleanor made Matthew swear on the family Bible that he would honor his brother's wishes about you. Hannah felt a surge of hope. She knows about the will, the trust fund? She knows everything. Eleanor was present when James recorded a video confession about Sarah, intended for you to watch when you turned 18. Nancy pulled out another envelope. She also has the original copy of James's amended will, the one that specifically prevents Matthew from using your inheritance for business purposes. Hannah opened the envelope to find legal documents that made her inheritance crystal clear. Not only was she entitled to half of James's personal fortune, but she owned 25% of Collins Tech, enough to have significant voting power in company decisions. Matthew has been using my shares to vote himself expanded authority, Hannah realized, scanning the corporate documents. For 5 years, he's essentially been stealing from you to build his empire. Collins Tech's recent expansion, the new facilities, the international contracts, all funded partially with money that belongs to you. Hannah's mind raced. How much are we talking about? Nancy consulted a financial statement. Current estimated value? Approximately $47 million. The number was so staggering that Hannah couldn't process it. She'd grown up in poverty while Matthew built a fortune using her money. There's more, Nancy continued grimly. Eleanor discovered that Matthew forged James's signature on several documents after his death, including papers that transferred your shares to his personal control. That's fraud. It's multiple felonies. But Eleanor needed proof of Matthew's intentions before acting. She's been waiting to see if he would honor James's deathbed promise. Hannah thought about her life in the Collins mansion, the psychological evaluations, the constant monitoring, Victoria's hostility. He never intended to tell me the truth, did he? I don't think so. Eleanor believes Matthew planned to keep you under his control indefinitely, possibly having you declared mentally incompetent when you turned 18. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Dr. Montgomery's reports weren't just evaluations. They were building a case for Hannah's mental instability, the isolation from peers, the constant supervision, the emphasis on her traumatic background. It was all designed to create a paper trail showing she was unfit to inherit. Eleanor wants to meet with you, Nancy said, but she insists on absolute secrecy. If Matthew discovers she's involved, he might take drastic action. Hannah thought about Frank's lifeless eyes, about Matthew's cold calculation as he arranged to dispose of the body. He's already taken drastic action. Then you understand the stakes. Eleanor is 82 years old, but she still has considerable influence in Seattle's legal and social circles. With her testimony and the evidence James left behind, we can expose everything Matthew has done. What about Frank's murder? Nancy's expression grew troubled. That's more complicated. Without a body or witnesses besides you, it would be difficult to prove. But the financial crimes are extensively documented. Hannah stood and moved to the window, watching ferries cross the darkening sound. Somewhere out there, Matthew was probably working late in his office, managing an empire built partially on stolen inheritance from the girl he'd claimed to rescue. When can I meet Eleanor? Tomorrow. But Hannah. Nancy's voice carried a warning. Once we begin this process, there's no going back. Matthew will fight viciously to protect himself, and you'll be his primary target. Hannah thought about her mother, a frightened 16-year-old who'd been manipulated and abandoned by the Collins family, ultimately driven to despair. She thought about Frank, whose greed had made him dangerous but whose death had been brutal and unnecessary. I'm not backing down, Hannah said firmly. Matthew has destroyed enough lives. It's time someone stopped him. Nancy smiled for the first time since Hannah had arrived. James would be proud of you. No, Hannah corrected, steel entering her voice. James was the problem, but I'm going to be the solution. Eleanor Collins Patterson's penthouse overlooked the city like a fortress of old money and older secrets. At 82, she possessed the sharp intelligence that had made the Collins family fortune and the moral clarity that her nephews lacked. You have your mother's eyes, Eleanor said, studying Hannah over delicate china teacups. But thank God you have stronger steel in your spine. Hannah sat straight, acutely aware she was meeting the woman who could change everything. Nancy told me you have evidence against Matthew, Evidence? Eleanor's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Child, I have enough evidence to bury Matthew so deep he'll need an archaeological expedition to find daylight. She opened an antique desk and withdrew a thick portfolio. Video confession from James, forged signatures on corporate documents, financial records showing systematic theft from your trust, and most damning, recorded conversations where Matthew explicitly states his intention to have you declared incompetent. Hannah's blood ran cold. You recorded him? For 2 years. Every family dinner, every phone call about your care. I knew something was wrong when he insisted on those psychological evaluations. Eleanor's eyes glittered with predatory satisfaction. Matthew always underestimated me. What about Frank's death? Eleanor's expression darkened. Nancy told me. While we can't prove murder without a body, we can prove Matthew has been systematically eliminating threats to his control. She produced another folder. I hired a private investigator months ago. He's documented Matthew's disposal of other problems. Business partners who asked inconvenient questions, former employees who knew too much about the family's secrets. Hannah felt sick. How many people has he hurt? Enough to establish a pattern. Combined with the financial crimes, it paints a picture of a man who will do anything to protect his stolen empire. Eleanor stood and moved to her window, gazing down at the city. I should have acted sooner. I told myself James's death was grief that Matthew would honor his promises. I was a foolish old woman. You're helping now. That's what matters. Yes, but carefully. Matthew has resources, connections, people who owe him favors. Eleanor turned back to Hannah. We need allies with power equal to his. Who did you have in mind? Eleanor smiled, and Hannah glimpsed the formidable woman who'd built a business empire decades before it was fashionable for women to do so. Olivia Reyes, the prosecutor who brought down the Pemberton family last year for tax fraud. She specializes in cases involving abuse of power and financial manipulation. Eleanor's smile sharpened. She also happens to be Sarah Morrison's daughter. Hannah's heart stopped. Morrison, but that was my mother's maiden name before she married Frank Wright, yes. Olivia is your cousin, Hannah, and she's been waiting her entire career for a chance to destroy the family that drove her aunt to suicide. The room seemed to tilt as Hannah processed this revelation. She had family, real family, who knew the truth and had the power to fight back. Olivia has been building a case against Matthew for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. Eleanor continued. Your testimony, combined with my evidence, gives her everything she needs. Hannah felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. Hope backed by real power. When do we move? She asked. Eleanor's smile became absolutely ruthless. Tomorrow night. Matthew's hosting a board meeting to approve his expansion into Asian markets using your money, of course. We're going to give him a very different kind of presentation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. By this time tomorrow, Matthew Collins would discover that his carefully constructed empire was about to crumble around him, and Hannah Wright Collins would finally claim what was rightfully hers. The Collins Tech boardroom fell silent as Hannah walked through the doors, flanked by Eleanor and a woman in a sharp navy suit, Olivia Reyes. Matthew's face went ashen as he recognized his aunt. What is the meaning of this interruption? Matthew demanded, though his voice trembled. Justice, Eleanor said simply, taking a seat at the conference table. Something long overdue in this family. Olivia placed a thick folder on the mahogany table. Matthew Collins, I'm Prosecutor Olivia Reyes. You're under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Victoria, who'd been sitting beside Matthew, shot to her feet. This is outrageous. Security. Won't be necessary, Hannah said quietly, her voice carrying new authority. The FBI is already positioned outside. Matthew's confident mask finally cracked. Hannah, you don't understand what you're doing. These people are manipulating you, like you manipulated my mother, Hannah interrupted. Like you've manipulated me for months? Olivia opened her folder, spreading documents across the table. Forged signatures, misappropriation of trust funds, conspiracy to commit fraud. She looked directly at Matthew. And that's just the financial crimes. You have no proof, Matthew snarled. Eleanor smiled coldly and pressed play on a small recorder. Matthew's own voice filled the room. The girl can never know about the inheritance. If she becomes problematic, we'll have her declared mentally incompetent. The board members exchanged horrified glances. Several were already reaching for their phones. Where's Frank Wright? Olivia asked quietly. Matthew's silence was deafening. We know what happened that night, Hannah said. I was there. I saw everything. Victoria suddenly turned on her husband. I told you this would happen. Your greed has destroyed us both. Shut up, Victoria, Matthew hissed. No, I won't go down for your crimes. Victoria faced the room. He killed. Frank Wright covered it up. I have emails, recordings. Matthew lunged toward Victoria, but FBI agents burst through the doors, weapons drawn. Matthew Collins, you're under arrest, the lead agent announced. As handcuffs clicked around Matthew's wrists, he looked at Hannah with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've unleashed. Hannah met his gaze steadily. I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped you from hurting anyone else. Olivia squeezed Hannah's shoulder. It's over. You're safe now. For the first time in her life, Hannah believed those words were true. 1 year later, Hannah stood before her mother's grave. No longer a simple wooden cross, but a beautiful marble headstone that read, Sarah Morrison Wright, beloved mother. Her truth lives on. The legal battles were finally over. Matthew had been sentenced to 25 years for fraud, embezzlement, and manslaughter in Frank's death, whose body investigators had found exactly where Hannah had indicated. Victoria received immunity in exchange for her testimony, fleeing. Seattle in disgrace, are you ready? Nancy asked, approaching through the cemetery's morning mist. Hannah nodded, touching the headstone one final time. Today marked another milestone, the official opening of the Sarah Morrison Foundation, dedicated to helping young victims of abuse and providing scholarships for underprivileged students. At 18, Hannah had inherited her full legacy. 47, $1 million in controlling interest in Collins Tech. But more importantly, she'd inherited the strength to transform tragedy into purpose. The foundation's headquarters occupied a renovated building in downtown Seattle, its walls lined with photographs of scholarship recipients and abuse survivors who'd found new hope. Hannah's office overlooked the Sound, where ferries carried people toward new beginnings. The dedication ceremony was beautiful, Olivia said, entering with 2 cups of coffee. Over the past year, she'd become more than Hannah's cousin. She'd become the sister Hannah never had. Mom would have been proud, Hannah replied, accepting the warmth gratefully. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but with dignity, intact. At 83, she'd become Hannah's mentor in both business and life. The first board meeting of the new Collins Tech is in an hour, Eleanor announced. Are you prepared for your speech? Hannah smiled. The company had been restructured, under her leadership, focusing on ethical technology solutions rather than profit at any cost. Many of Matthew's cronies had been removed, replaced by people who shared Hannah's vision of responsible innovation. I've been preparing for this my whole life, Hannah said. The 3 women made their way to Collins Tech's headquarters where Hannah would address employees as their new CEO. She'd kept the Collins name not out of pride, but as a reminder that power could be used for healing rather than harm. In the lobby, a portrait of James Collins had been replaced with one of Sarah Morrison, not as a victim but as a young woman full of dreams and potential. Beside it, a plaque read, In memory of those silenced by power, may their voices guide us toward justice. Nancy had moved into the penthouse's guest wing, serving as Hannah's guardian and confidant. Together, they'd created something neither had imagined possible, a family built on truth rather than secrets. As Hannah took the stage before hundreds of employees, she thought about the scared 16-year-old who'd arrived at this building a year ago. That girl had been powerless, manipulated, and alone. The woman standing here today owned it all. My mother was 16 when she died inside these walls, Hannah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. Not physically. That came later, but the girl full of dreams and hope was destroyed here by people who saw her as disposable. The room was absolutely silent. Today we begin again. This company will never again profit from silence or prey on the vulnerable. We will build technology that serves humanity, not the other way around. As applause filled the room, Hannah caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, Eliza, now a college graduate and the Foundation's program director. Her friend gave her a thumbs up, grinning with pride. That evening, Hannah returned to the small house she'd bought overlooking the Sound, modest by Collins standards but rich in peace. Nancy was in the kitchen, humming while she prepared dinner, and the normalcy of it still took Hannah's breath away. "Any regrets?" Nancy asked as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the water gold. Hannah considered the question seriously. The past year had brought justice, but also the weight of responsibility she'd never asked for. Money couldn't bring back her mother or undo the trauma of her childhood, but it could prevent other children from suffering the same fate. "None," Hannah said finally. "This is what Mom would have wanted, her story helping others instead of being buried in shame." As stars emerged over Puget Sound, Hannah Wright Collins, daughter, survivor, and now guardian of justice, smiled. She'd transformed her inheritance of pain into a legacy of hope, and that was the greatest revenge of all.